Welcome to, or welcome back to, the Agatha May Detective Agency. I'm Agatha May, and in this episode, we're going to look at Myrtle Beach, South Carolina newspaper, The Sun News, and we'll talk a little about John Paul Miller's many lawsuits. This past Sunday, February 2nd, 2025, Emalyn Muzzy, a reporter for The Sun News, was at Solid Rock Church. She attempted to interview some of the protesters and asked them what kind of evidence they had against John Paul Miller. Emalyn is young, so I'll try to be gracious, but come on, chick. Why would you ask that question? She then went inside the church and sat through the service. Emalyn, I seriously doubt the newspaper is paying you enough for that. I emailed Chris Segal, the editor of The Sun News, as well as Emalyn, to ask why she was asking the protesters for what evidence they had against John Paul. I also asked if she was at the church as a reporter or as a congregant. I explained that there were text messages that were allegedly from John Paul Miller that showed he was allegedly paying alleged people to get defamatory statements from them. Allegedly. And that in light of that, the reporter standing outside his church asking for evidence looked a bit suspect. I didn't receive an answer from Chris Segal or from Emalyn, but breaking news editor Terry Richardson did answer me, and here's what she wrote. Hi, Agatha. Chris Segal forwarded me your message regarding our reporter, Emalyn Muzzy. If you read Emalyn's story online today, you will see all the details and information that she gathered that Sunday in her story. It is her job to talk to all sides and ask questions. Emalyn was at the church on Sunday to do a follow-up story on the recent lawsuits that had been filed against protesters. It was then that she realized that church was actually being conducted in the building, something we were not aware of as we had been told the church was closed. She went into the church to see what was happening and then found that John Paul Miller was actually preaching. She questioned him about these things after service was over. She asked the questions of the protesters to find out why they are still protesting and what they are hoping will happen. We are not gathering evidence for either side. However, if accusations are going to be made, it is our job to find out what basis or evidence backs up those accusations. I invite you or other people who would like to speak about what is happening with the lawsuits or protests to do so. Please let me know if that's something you would like to do. Thank you, Terry Richardson, breaking news editor, Myrtle Beach Sun News. Well, I did read Emalyn's story online today, and we're going to talk about that in a minute because it was super bad. How did the Sun News not know that the church wasn't currently closed? How did they not know that John Paul had held services at the hay barn behind the rat hole and then at X-Gym Sports Mall? I find it difficult to believe that a local newspaper didn't know that. Now, I don't know if it's worse to think they're lying about it or that they're telling the truth and they didn't actually know. How is it that people who are from scattered corners of the world were aware that John Paul was moving the church around Myrtle Beach like it was a pop-up restaurant that had been caught serving bad shellfish and now had the health department after it? But the people who live in his backyard didn't know? Has someone been holding them hostage at their newspaper office and not giving them access to the internet? I realize they have other things to report on, but shouldn't the reporters do at least a little research before jumping on a story? So, are they lying about not knowing, or are they just incompetent? And why was Emalyn surprised to find John Paul preaching? Hasn't he been preaching? Fitz News reported on September 3rd, 2024, that John Paul had returned to the pulpit on September 1st. Again, does the Sun News pay attention to the ongoing stories they're reporting on? Then there's this part of Terry's email, quote, however, if accusations are going to be made, it is our job to find out what basis or evidence backs up those accusations, end quote. Asking protesters who are being sued by John Paul Miller what evidence they have against him is just not trying to find a basis or evidence of accusations. They aren't the ones doing the accusing. He's the one filing the lawsuits. He has to provide the evidence of whatever he's attempting to claim. Asking them what evidence they have while in litigation with him definitely sounds like you're trying to get information for him. So as far as Terry offering me to contact her and say what I think of the lawsuits and their coverage of them, I don't know that she'd want to print what I had to say. Now about that article that Emalyn wrote. It started with, quote, Myrtle Beach pastor John Paul Miller has returned to the pulpit after having spent months entrenched in controversy over his late wife's suicide, end quote. Well, we've already covered that, but when the article starts with a statement that doesn't seem to be true, then what can we really expect from the rest of it? Let's find out. The article also read, quote, John Paul Miller has filed multiple restraining orders against the protesters, but they are still showing up, undeterred by the threats, end quote. How does the reporter know that? From what I understand, restraining orders aren't part of the public record. So is this something John Paul told the reporter? And I think undeterred by threats could be rewritten as unwilling to be bullied. The article continues, quote, Solid Rock Church closed in November with Living Water Church taking over its assets, Russell Long, John Paul Miller's lawyer, previously said. On February 2nd, Miller said he's not involved with Living Water Church, despite records showing that he applied for a business license for the nonprofit, end quote. So Rumpled Russell with 2 L's sure did say that, but we quickly learned that while it may have been true when he said it, it didn't stay true for very long. Pun intended. And John Paul is still the registered agent for Living Water Church at Market Common. He quote-unquote sold the property on Highway 17 that was slotted for a new church campus to Living Water Church at Market Common Incorporated for a total of $10. So it basically amounts to a deed transfer, and he used Tricia Ross's home address on the deed. Is John Paul not actually part of it, or is he transferring assets to it for Tricia to continue the church in the event he ends up in big kid prison? Are we to believe he willingly gave millions of dollars worth of land to a church that he has nothing to do with? Well, maybe that's why he's trying to sue protesters at a max of $7,500 a pop. He's trying to make up the loss of that property. Or maybe he sold the property to Living Water as a way to try and convince the court that he's poor and it's all the protesters' fault. The dismal excuse of an article also had this bit, quote, Miller said he began preaching again about the beginning of 2025, although he hasn't always had a place to do so. He's taken the congregation to unconventional spaces for Sunday service, such as a gym and an empty store, before returning to the cleared-out Market Common Church, various sources said, end quote. So, who's been preaching all those Sundays if it's not John Paul? Because, once again, Fitz News reported that John Paul was back in the saddle on September 1st, 2024, and their article states they spoke to multiple sources. Emalyn included this text that John Paul sent the Sun News in her article. Quote, I spent 2024 giving mercy to everyone who slandered me, abused me, defamed me, and invaded my privacy. I gave so much mercy that I helped start a new church called Mercy Church. But in 2025, God spoke to me and told me to give the mob what they wanted. They never asked for mercy, they demanded justice. So in 2025, I'll be pursuing justice, end quote. Well, that is one of the dumbest statements I've ever read. But isn't it just so cute how he used the word mob just like his dad did? And the protesters aren't standing out there with pitchforks and torches, you doink. They have cameras and signs. Does this statement John Paul made about the protesters scream mercy?
A group of people have repeatedly stood outside Miller's Solid Rock Church Censor Deaf, holding signs that say, Justice for Micah.
I want her to be remembered as a woman who loved her church more than anything. The very church that these idiot protesters, they're not even protesters really, they're just un-American people who were trying to scare Christians, but they're coming against the thing that Micah loved. She loved her church more than anything, remember by that. And that's a good thing to be remembered by the way.
I know John Paul likes to use the Micah loved the church so you shouldn't hurt it bit, but let's remember that it's the same church she turned into the IRS. Also, the church is the people, and most of them have left Solid Rock, Living Water at Market Common, Mercy, Land Sakes Alive Church. And does this text that John Paul Miller had previously sent to the Sun News ooze mercy? Quote, these people are not protesting. Solid Rock believes in the right to protest. These people are pagans who are trying to stop Christians from worshiping. They slander, they speak evil lies, they take pictures of children, and they wear masks while standing in front of parishioners who try to enter and leave the house of the Lord. These vicious pagans stand in the streets, use illegal blowhorns, and laugh at the city police because the city is doing nothing to stop them from harassing Christians who simply want to worship together for 1 hour. They make a mockery of the Christian faith, having a man dressed up like Jesus walk around scaring innocent parishioners as they enter the church. End quote. Except the protesters are protesting. They have a permit to protest. And it's not 1972, so the word pagan isn't a scary word like it was back then. I know plenty of people who are pagans, and the worst they do to you is show you their pretty rocks and moss they collected in the woods earlier that day and maybe make you something to eat. When have the protesters ever stood in front of anyone trying to enter the church? The police aren't doing anything to stop them because protesting is their First Amendment right. I do think it's funny that John Paul thinks that someone dressed as Jesus would scare his parishioners, though. The only people who have been arrested since the protesters have been showing up at the church are John Paul Miller and Waterboy Robert Lockle, and both arrests were for assault. The Post and Courier published an article on 2/5/2025 about the lawsuits. They shared excerpts from one of the lawsuits that John Paul had filed. Quote, "The interest that a subsect of people have in Miller and in the life of his late wife was created entirely by defendant and others like her who have determined on their own that Miller is guilty of a crime that law enforcement officials have cleared him of or never charged him with committing, according to a complaint. Miller alleged protesters publicized his personal affairs and wrongfully intruded in his life, which he argued has no public concern since he's a private citizen. Miller claimed that protesters have filmed him for months and screamed and yelled at him." End quote. Subset John Paul, not subsect. And sorry, Bob, but your wife's death became national news not long after the video of you announcing her death was made public. Now, pastors are typically considered to be public figures, and when one is thrust into the national news scene, whether they want to be or not, and then has their house raided by the FBI, they can't really tell people that the public shouldn't be concerned. He might not want them to be, but boy howdy they are, and they have a right to be. The article further stated that, according to one of the lawsuits, quote, "Defendant's actions have been calculated to intimidate Miller from appearing in public and conducting his normal activities, including the operation of his church," according to one of the complaints. Defendant's actions have been calculated to intimidate or influence others from congregating at Miller's church or with Miller in any setting, end quote. No one is stopping John Paul from having church, and the evidence of that is that he's still having church. For someone who claims to be intimidated about going out in public, there sure have been a lot of photos of him out in public. And a good part of them have been with him and little Susie Q. Skinner, looking like she just had to eat a cold lard and toilet lint sandwich. According to the article, John Paul also made this claim in one of his lawsuits, quote, "Miller also alleged that protesters shared his personal information online, including his license plate, to social media and to Facebook groups that were dedicated to Miller's late wife. Also on social media, Miller alleged that protesters wrongfully appropriated his personality by falsely accusing him of abusing and killing his wife Micah, according to court records. Miller claimed that protesters sought to enrich themselves, monetize the videos of him on their social media pages, and prevent him from working and living in Horry County, according to court records. Defendant's conduct constitutes the unwarranted appropriation or exploitation of Miller's personality and private affairs, with which the public has no legitimate concern, or the wrongful intrusion into Miller's private activities, according to one of the complaints." End quote. Wasn't the Robeson County Sheriff's Office the first to share his license plate online? It was in the report they released on May 6, 2024, and even shared different angles of it. And as far as anyone making money on this case, that's how news works. It's not free. People get paid for it. So does this mean John Paul is going to sue any of the news outlets who have reported on him? I mean, they are definitely making money off of him. Or is it easier to just try and bully protesters? Also, just because someone makes money off of John Paul, it doesn't prove in any way that he's lost income. And if he's claiming a loss of income, he has to prove that those he is suing directly caused him to lose money. There are former members of Solid Rock who have come forward to talk about leaving the church before Micah's death, and attributed it to John Paul speaking disparagingly about Micah from the pulpit. And if I remember correctly, church attendance dropped dramatically immediately after Micah's death. Someone named Francis Anthony made a post on Facebook. I'm not sure if Francis is a he or a she, but Francis kind of writes like a woman, so she's a she until I learn otherwise. Now, Francis lives in Virginia, and she traveled to Myrtle Beach for Micah's memorial service that John Paul held at Solid Rock Church. She seems to be very pro-Solid Rock, or at least she was when she wrote this. In her post, she wrote that she had attended the morning church service at Solid Rock that day and was appalled that there were so few people there for the first service. So she stayed for the second service, and according to her, attendance was so low that she wrote that she was stunned and so saddened. So I'm not sure that protesters or anyone that's talked about Micah's death can be blamed for members leaving John Paul's church. I can't help but think that maybe the church is lacking congregants because of the way John Paul announced Micah's death, and then the way he conducted himself during the memorial service he held. Maybe his congregation numbers have stayed low because people have seen court documents from his ex-wife Allison, where she alleged that he had essayed underage girls at his church and hired prostitutes. Maybe people have learned that John Paul wasn't allowed to have his own daughter for overnight visits. And maybe they've learned that he'd lost custody and visitation of his children. Maybe people have read Micah's list, which, according to Regina Ward, was compiled from Micah's own words, written and spoken, and alleges that she endured horrific abuse at the hands of John Paul. I have had former church members of Solid Rock reach out to me and tell me that John Paul was not the person they thought he was. So maybe the 50 or so remaining congregants are the only people in Myrtle Beach who actually want to attend John Paul's church. Maybe it doesn't matter what he's calling the church or what people are saying about him online, and maybe it doesn't matter how many protesters are there on the sidewalk on Sunday mornings. Maybe people don't want to attend John Paul's church simply because it's John Paul's church. Anyone mentioned in this video is innocent until proven guilty. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, subscribe, and comment as this helps my channel grow. Until next time, stay safe and be happy.